Hi everyone, this is Rohit from Lifestyle Mastery. Today I'm excited to have Bo Abrams, who's the founder of Kommu, which is a connected home sharing and travel platform that links users with their personal network and lets them host trusted friends, interest groups, and communities in their homes on their own terms. Bo has done his MBA from UCLA. Welcome to the show, bro.
Thank you so much for having me, Rohit. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. So we had an interesting chat before this. You have a very interesting journey. We'll talk about Como, but how did you get your start in startups? And you've got a lot of experience when it comes to hedge funds and VC, but what got you interested in this crazy world of tech startups?
Yeah, I will say I feel like my early career was a bit of playing Goldilocks, and I'm always forever grateful for that. I ended up transferring into my college. It's a longer story, but I only had one summer, technically speaking, in between my junior and senior year to try out an internship. I didn't know anything about investment banking or consulting and how much work goes into like whatever that job would be, and so I ended up at a law firm, and kind of quickly realized that I didn't really want to be a lawyer, in that way, and so this hedge fund, they came and recruited on campus at Haverford. Some alumni worked in the marketing department, and I was like, this is in LA. This is where I grew up at Haverford's in Philadelphia. I had no idea what a hedge fund was.
Yeah.
And it turns out I started out, it was really an assistant job at first. But that's all to say, I've worked and learned a lot about investors and institutional, fundraising. But I realized like it would be a long journey, I think, to really climb that ladder and to own a book of business at that amazing place that I learned so much from. And so startups felt like this natural inclination towards kind of getting my hands dirty and having that agency and autonomy at an early age to
Yeah.
make a key difference in an organization. And so that's why I decided to go work at Steelhouse, which is now called Mountain.
Interesting. And before the call, I talked about how in Asia you have a lot of operators, especially, you have the chief operating officers who are either from consulting backgrounds or they're from investing background. But how was your experience in Canon Partners and did it help you get to where you are right now? And, did the knowledge and the understanding about finances and all did help you to, build the company which you're
Yeah,
building it?
yeah. I will say there's a great book. It's I think David Epstein is the author, called Range. It's a New York Times bestseller, and I really, obviously, I'm very biased because I think it explains a lot of my trajectory. But that's all to say. The argument for that book is that the world is not about being a specialist. Really, it's
Yeah.
about being a generalist and getting all these different experiences. And I felt that way as an athlete too. Like I felt like my football ability was helped my physicality in basketball,
Yeah.
but my and so on and so forth. So in work, I felt like at every job along the way, I learned something really valuable about what kind of worker I was, what I was good at, what I was bad at.
Yeah.
And then ultimately, like I got to witness really successful people, especially like Canyon is a great example of that is the pinnacle of finance. Like those are some of the best, not only investors in the world, but fundraisers and client relationship managers and so on. And just to see their work ethic, to see like how that level of intensity, and then also see how institutional investment markets work overall,
Yeah.
right? Like where the capital's flowing, how these institutions manage their portfolios. All of that was a huge learning experience for me. And so that's I'll say. There's a million ways it's helped me now, but ultimately it just showed me, there's a big world out there of various jobs just in financial markets, let alone startups and technology that
Yeah.
you can play a part in, and you just got to go find that place where you're you know going to succeed because you know that that's where you belong.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And marketplace is quite of interest for me because I worked in two different marketplaces in two different markets. One was a student accommodation marketplace here in the UK, and then a travel marketplace, a hotel marketplace called OYO Rooms, which went on to raise around $4 billion from SoftBank. But what inspired you to build Como, and how does it differentiate from other home sharing platforms like Airbnb?
Yeah, I will say first and foremost, like marketplaces, you're so right that people tend to be very passionate about marketplaces, and it's for good reason. Now knowing this, marketplaces tend to outperform when they do go public, right? They hit that tipping point and that network effect, and then
Yeah.
they disproportionately become some of the massive companies, the Ubers, the Airbnbs of the world. That being said, stepping back to like this journey to Komu and why I started it, I had no plans of starting a company and going to business school. And in fact, going to business school is almost a negative signal to potential investors and startup founders because you're a risk averse person by nature in that sense.
Yeah.
And I was trying to go, go to some consulting job or whatever to get paid well while I figured out what I was supposed to do with my life. And
Yeah.
one thing I did know was I like to think so. I was a pretty good student in high school,
Mm.
paid for I did not pay for it. I took all the AP courses. I got the good test scores. I was in the band. I was a three-sport athlete. I was a captain, all that stuff. And I got absolutely obliterated initially trying to get into colleges. And so I got very lucky and transferred in after going into junior college to a college that I never even would have gotten close to when I applied out of high school. That being said, this go around when I wanted to go to business school, I
Mm.
was like, I'm not losing to the rich kids that like had the consultants and the tutors and the whole thing. So I took the GMAT 7 times. I paid for the business school tutors and consultants. I spent all the money I had trying to get into the Stanfords, Harvards, Wardens of the world. Did not get in. Was supposed to go to a different school back east, but ended up that COVID hit. I
Yeah.
didn't want to leave my family in LA. It was actually the same with my co-founder. He was supposed to go to a different school as well, LA guy that went to Stanford for undergrad, and he applied to UCLA. And they both offered us money, I think mostly because they knew that they needed to fill seats, right? Like we're going to other schools. They don't know if people are going to be able to get into the country. That's all to say.
Yeah.
I got in and I was like, I deserve a break. Let me go clear my head. And I go on a trip to Montana. It was
Mm.
Whitefish, Montana. It was beautiful. And I booked an Airbnb, and 4 nights at a crappy Airbnb in Montana was half my rent for the month in LA. And, I look a lot older. I'm 32, but I was at the time I was, whatever, 28, 27 years old. And I'm thinking my apartment is my most sacred and my most expensive asset. I pay my rent for it. I can never leverage it on short-term rental platforms for good reason. But now I can't even afford short-term rentals as a guest. And
Mm.
it really started to kind of build up in my mind because I remember using Turo out there and
Mm.
thinking, wow, it was really hard to find a rental car in that area. So Turo was great, peer-to-peer marketplace to share your cars. And I'm like, why can't I do this in my home? And you would think that's what Airbnb is.
True.
But that's where the research started. You started to see that actually there's different categories. Oyo is a good example, but like you have hotels, obviously,
True.
which we all know are what the experience is and they're expensive. Then you have short-term rentals, which we argue this is really a core problem, have evolved into professionalized second and third investment properties for property managers to make as much profit as possible. And then there's the home sharing market, which I would argue is really us, and there's home swapping platforms. There's trusted pet sitters as a good example that are trying to say, hey, these primary homes, these main homes, they are not online. There's an untapped market there that's massive that the short-term rental market really can't touch. And so we initially started as a home swapping platform. We can talk more about that journey and the pivot to what we are today. But what ended up happening was all that research really as a potential investor, like or somebody that wanted to be an investor through business school, illuminated this opportunity. And I said, man, I really believe on first principle that this is a huge opportunity. Somebody's going to win big here. It's not been won yet. And it is going to be very scary to be a founder, especially after business school, like with
Yeah.
debt and then the whole shebang. But it'd be really dangerous not to try because I was afraid to, right? I thought at the end of the day, I'm going to look back and regret that I was too scared to go forward and to go build it and to not like do it. And we all have ideas, right? We all have things
Right.
that we think and we're like, oh yeah, I'm going to go do that. But people sometimes they don't and they regret it. So that was ultimately the driving force for me and my co-founder to go forward and build Kommu.
Interesting. And at OYO rooms, we were very inspired by Airbnb, but the South Asian, East Asian market was so different because as I mentioned, we unlike the Western countries, we weren't very comfortable charging money from guests who come into their homes. It's a very cultural thing over there. But how do you manage to offer stays at an average rate of around 84 to $85 per night? And what are the strategies that you're doing to maintain that sort of affordability for people who can stay at Como?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it really speaks to the roadmap and really like the plan and the differentiator ahead, which is to say, in a traditional marketplace like an Airbnb, in, of course, capitalistic Western society, this feels like it was inevitably going to happen. And by the way, not a bad problem necessarily at all, in that, like, I wouldn't mind being Airbnb and generating $10 billion a year in profit and being $100 billion market cap company like that. That has been a giant market that they've created.
Right.
The short-term rental market is $3 trillion and growing. And
Mm.
so with all due respect, I tremendously respect the Airbnb team and what they built. Unfortunately, Pandora's box opened, right? And
Yeah.
that led to this greed. That means that I'm going to keep on, once the demand was unlocked post COVID and people could live and work remotely more frequently, of course, prices started to rise. Regulators started to, key in on that because naturally, um, this that does have a disruption to communities. It does have a disruption to, short to housing supply for people in these major cities. Right? And
Right.
so for us, we've actually not, this speaks a little bit more to our go to market and marketing, but what we ended up doing that was a big pivot was we opened things up. We made Kommu so that it was an open experience for anybody to start and that all of our hosts can list their homes publicly because they have a need, right? They were turning to Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or posting on Instagram. And we're like, why are these millennials and Gen Zers who don't use Facebook, no offense to Mark Zuckerberg, as a social network at all anymore? They use Instagram. Why
Right.
are they even turning to these platforms just to list their homes? And it's because Airbnb isn't serving that core market.
Mm.
And we're like, we have this plan in place to actually make sure that people are listing for their fair market value. Like we've seen what happened with Airbnb, and we can talk more about how to enforce that. But naturally speaking, people have been listing for cost for the most part. We guide them on that, saying take your monthly rent divided by 30, take your mortgage divided by 30. And it's been working. Like people have been getting booked and they love it because they're not here trying to just make a profit, but they are here trying to recoup the sunk value of their home. They're also,
Yeah.
again, swapping and oftentimes finding pet sitters. The whole point is we just get to witness that behavior, right? Especially in those early stages and say, okay, is pricing becoming a problem or is it not? And when we saw that it wasn't, we knew we didn't have to focus on that at this moment in time. But that obviously, as this thing starts to scale, if we remain open to start for people until they add their friends and it build that network out on Komu, that's when we have safeguards in place to actually show and just display the fair market value of a home and to have users contest that if they don't feel like they're getting or able to list for the right price. But if you want to charge for a premium, you should register with the cities that you operate in. You should adhere to those ordinances, and that whole business should be regulated, in my opinion.
Right.
But that's not our business. We're not in the short-term rental business.
Mm. Interesting. And I've been into different marketplaces at a very early stage, and we would usually start out from like the home city. With Ovid, this was Gurgaon, and with Hyber, this was Bristol. Even though we are based in here in London, but uh, but did you also start in LA, and what's your strategy about expanding into different cities?
Yeah, so we naturally did start in LA just because we're from LA, we're LA
Yeah.
founders, and we did the natural like built a wait list up. I can tell you learned a lot of things the hard way. Like we had this amazing wait list and strategy. We used a great tool to kind of gamify that. And so many people are like, oh, I've been looking for a platform like this. And then you try to convert that wait list over, and people, they just don't convert. And these are all the hard lessons that founders learn only through doing it. But that's to say, we had a natural network in LA, a
Mm.
natural network in San Francisco, and a natural network in New York. That was mostly because I went to school on the East Coast. A lot of my friends are in
Yeah.
New York. Gus went to school in the Bay Area. That's his network. And we both were in LA. And the idea was we knew that our target user sort of had a psychographic that ultimately placed them in those cities. And then if we onboarded people in those cities, there would be a high likelihood of that K factor and that social overlap of, oh, Rohit, he's in London. We have mutual friends. I might bridge that trust now, and I might be more inclined to book Rohit. What ended up happening though was we didn't constrain it. So hosts did start popping up in Jackson, Wyoming, and Lisbon and Mexico City, because what ended up happening is people were like, this was great. I had a great experience. I saved money. I had somebody I trusted as a host and or a guest, and they tell their friends about it. And so you naturally start to see the dispersion out, but you do focus your marketing efforts on how do you launch these cities. And so we can talk more about like what specific strategies we did, there. But ultimately, you're right. Like it was focus on some core cities where the problem is the biggest, where the
Yeah.
expenses are the greatest, and the regulations are the strictest.
Right, right, right. Interesting. And as I mentioned earlier, as both on the supply and demand side of the marketplace, especially when you come in so early, you're more like a generalist. I've been all over the place. But what comes first? Is it supply or is it demand in a marketplace? I know it's a chicken and egg situation, but what really happened first for at Como?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the conventional wisdom would always say you need to go get the supply first. And obviously,
Yeah.
like, that was what we were focused on. And what was nice about that, and still is that we knew where the supply lived because we would see it all the time. You could go on Facebook Marketplace or you can go
Yeah.
on Craigslist and you can see, ultimately there's WhatsApp groups, there's all these different places people are paying to list their homes, and we know how to actually to pull them over to Kommu. The demand is harder for
Yeah.
sure because you're basically trying to generate a network effect
Yeah.
in lieu of actually charging, that annual subscription and kind of gamifying this high end membership experience. You're ultimately just trying to make sure that enough people see all these hosts that you have listed all over the world and
Yeah.
that they're booking them. So the hosts keep coming back for more. But yes, like the good news was for us, there was a little bit of an irony in that really the supply kind of was the demand. And that I know that sounds confusing, but it's to say the problem really exists for the hosts. For them, leaving New York for a month is $3,000 of sunk rent. They are going out of their way
Yeah.
to list and to like ultimately have their places filled. Obviously, if you're a guest, that difference that out or the difference between $300 a night at an Airbnb or hotel and $90 a night in New York City at a Kommu is a big difference that can add up. But the hosts were the ones that were taking all the key actions and searching for guests, and so they're the ones that were inviting their friends to the network. They're the ones that were spending the most time on the app, the most engaged. And so we really focused on that because we knew how to go acquire them.
Mm.
And we also knew that this would only bode well for when we did start to really scale up the demand, which is really where we are at right now, is showing the world all these amazing homes that are available to them in one central place,
Yeah.
so that we can get to the next stage as a company.
Hmm. Interesting. And with marketplaces, sometimes since you are representing, other hotels or this could be other accommodation houses, you uh, are always struggling with customer service. But how do you ensure, trust and safety for both hosts and guests on your platform?
Yeah, I mean, that is the focus, right? Like, and
Yeah.
it is true that like we really believe that, and that's honestly partly like why we haven't just blitz scaled this thing yet, because obviously we need to put those safeguards in place because we've learned from when things can go awry in the early days. Like we've seen, that people have those questions all the time of how do you verify that this place is real, this person lives there, that this person is real, and that I'm going to get off a plane and go, land in New York City and walk through that door and get to a Komu that I paid for.
Hmm.
The free model that we built has been great in that it's been like almost the despite test, I would call it. You do need to do your two-factor. You have your phone number, and people list their Instagrams and their LinkedIn's. And our target users, because they're born of the age of dating apps and things like that, do a tremendous job of essentially social proofing just with that information.
Hmm.
But we do know they want underwriting. They want us to back them up when they're dealing with somebody that's not just a direct connection, right? They want to say, hey, if I'm paying an annual subscription, I want to know I'm covered if I can't get through that door, and that Comb's going to have my back and put me at a hotel for a couple of days while they find me an alternative. If you're a host and you want to know that God forbid if anything were to happen with a friend of a friend trashing your place, Comb will have you covered. We haven't had a single incident like that, but that is all to say like people want that assurance because obviously we're our minds are prone to thinking through the worst case scenario, especially when you're dealing with real life,
Yeah.
going to somebody's home and staying there. And so right now, that is what we are building out and turning on. We're using a great team that has done some of the best marketplaces ever, including Turo, to to turn that on. So that's been a full circle moment for us. But ultimately, like the ways that we can do that are through various vendors that do home verification, ID verification, cost and fair market value verification, and then to have a protection plan in place that ultimately covers all of these extenuating circumstances that we all worry about. The
Hmm.
beautiful thing is you want to take that risk on as a company because your risk until you scale to a massive level is
Yeah.
actually safer than the current market risk. And that is to say, there's a much higher likelihood, albeit very, very, very slim, that a short-term rental goes awry and air cover and Airbnb has your back. We will be, and we believe will be true even at millions of homes, much safer than that because of the social mechanisms that we've built in the app to show you how you're connected and so on and so forth. And until you get to a massive sort of catastrophic loss category, right, where like a hurricane could hit a region, that's when you offload that risk to, a Lloyd's of London, for instance. In the
Hmm.
meantime, in a lot of ways, the value we provide is a form of assurance and insurance to say we've got you covered,
Right. Right.
and that's what we're turning on right now.
Got it. Got it. Interesting. And I read about how Airbnb and Uber had really impacted, uh, some of those expensive places in New York as well as in London, and so was the case with Oyo, where we are disrupting the whole hotel market. How do you see your model impacting that, the traditional hotel industry, especially in high cost areas like LA, San Francisco, and New York?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely see ourselves as fundamentally disruptive, and obviously, like we even say we think we're disrupting the disruptor in Airbnb. But what's really been great to sort of see play out, and when I say great, I mean like advantageous for Kommu
Yeah,
is like let's look at what happened in New York City, right? The hotel lobby essentially pushed Airbnb out, and really, I will say again, I do believe that there should be regulations in place for short-term rentals, but
yeah,
realistically, like the problems that New York City are experiencing, it should not be attributed to just Airbnb. It's really more of a citywide problem and a housing supply problem.
yeah,
That's all to say they pushed Airbnb out, and guess what happened? Average daily rates for hotels shot up because it's just a matter of supply and demand. And really, we're coming in and we're planning on working with regulators. Like we won the largest business plan and pitch competition at UCLA, working with the law school by actually understanding and digging into these regulations and ordinances. And we're saying, hey, this model that we've built, it does not have the same effect as short-term rentals. We're not letting people profit, but if you don't give them a platform like this, there's no affordable alternatives to protect consumers, and there's no opportunity for people to recoup their asset value in a hyperinflated recessionary environment where consumers that are millennials and Gen Zers are in record amounts of consumer debt, just
yeah,
trying to live their lives because they care more about that than what I used to care about, which was working my ass off to get 14 days vacation per year and stay at a hotel.
yeah.
So that's all to say we believe we are going to work in that area, and there's other networks that are is sort of in this wave with us, which is really exciting. Of like there's a startup battle, so to speak, but
Yeah.
that we're all moving in the same direction, which is there has to be alternatives to short-term rentals and hotels, or consumers will just get absolutely gutted
Hmm.
and will not be able to travel, and that's a right that they have. And so I don't know if that was a long-winded way of answering that question, but ultimately it is to say like we think that there should be all options: hotels, short-term rentals, really for group travel,
Right.
and Kommus for primary residences and sharing through trusted networks.
Interesting. And you mentioned about millennials and Gen Zs a couple of times, but I wanted to understand, what's the uh, what's the thesis for these generations when it comes to home ownership? Are they looking to buy homes? I know that people are delaying marriage, delaying kids, and delaying buying homes. But since you've been working on this market, what's the thesis for these generations when it comes to travel and home ownership? How are they looking at it, going forward?
Yeah, I mean that really is the whole opportunity, right? And like that, I will
Yeah.
say there were like people will be like, "Oh man, like Kommu, what a brilliant idea!" And I'm like, "This wasn't my idea. Like
Mm.
this idea, like we have investors and advisors, and we know competitors and people that have been around since before COVID that have tried to build something like this, and we have various theses on why they didn't succeed. But the core one was timing, right?
Yeah.
It was that demand was not unlocked until the pandemic made hybrid and remote work this new
Yeah.
paradigm that we believe will be in existence for a long time.
True.
Um, and so even before the pandemic, millennials and Gen Zers, I think those generations really were focused on experiences and living their lives because, we did witness that from our parents' generations. Like, of course, they did an amazing job of building up this amazing economy, so to speak, that we've had. They've also taken all of the wealth. They've made it hyper competitive for us to exist. The wages have not risen with inflation,
Yeah.
and that's for me where there's a reason I took the GMAT 7 times. I think with the third score I had, I would have gotten into Stanford Business School 20, 30 years ago. Like, that's all to say.
Yeah.
Millennials and Gen Zers are sort of fed up with feeling like they are trying so hard to get ahead to do things right. I won't name specifically who because I don't want to out her, but somebody very close to me is an amazing, amazing person, and she worked her butt off at a
Yeah.
startup, and she really tried. And then I was like, these companies, including Kommu, they're not loyal to you. Like
Yeah.
they're not family. This is a business.
True.
And she got laid off right after like a huge event that she had to spend a lot of, it's really like, it really rubbed me the wrong way. But that was all to say, I was like, I think there was a realization that we should not, live to work. We should work to live. And so
Yeah.
they are in record amounts of consumer debt to quite literally travel and experience and live their lives and not, work 100 hours per week.
Mm.
And they really see travel as this means to connect. That's part of what Kommu is actually about. It's really about saying, hey, when you're going to New York, let your friends know, see what places you could be staying at that's available to you, and go take that trip to see that person that you haven't seen in a
Mm.
long time. And I think that's a really beautiful, like, wonderful thing that, people are able to do that, and we're empowering that because it makes them better human beings.
Right.
But yeah, that's all to say. We also have a big debt crisis on our hands that is somehow going to get worked out in time. I,
Right.
I have I have no idea how, but we're helping reduce the costs at least in the meantime.
Yeah. Yeah. Got it. Interesting. And when it comes to marketplaces, putting money on paid ads or acquiring customers is always a you know it does take time for you to build those sort of growth strategies. But what's been your strategy when it comes to marketing and acquiring customers at Komu?
Yeah, I mean, marketing is a really interesting challenge, especially with marketplaces in particular. There's so many dynamics that you have to deal with, and everybody has, different approaches. I think Lenny Rashitsky from Airbnb, Lenny's newsletter,
Yeah.
he had a great article on this, like the 7 different kind of approaches, generally speaking, that people take to
Yeah.
grow those marketplaces out and solve for the cold start problem. And, you know, ultimately we've tried many. I can tell you, like, we've tried paid strategies, which I think paid is really great when you actually, do have your business model fully turned on and you can measure your LTV to CAC. And as long as your
Yeah.
LTV to CAC is positive, like, pour money into those channels until they scale out. And before then, though, it's like, first and foremost, we knew brand mattered. We knew design mattered. And we knew that mattered because we think that's what Airbnb proved. It wasn't that we want somebody in our, we want to share our homes with people. It actually turns out we want to share our second and third homes with strangers and make as much money as humanly possible.
Right.
But what they did prove was design and brand, and that trust was the differentiator and why they really pulled out ahead. So it was really starting there and, like, knowing that that needed to be a foundational piece, in this trusted, affordable marketplace. And then from there, it became a little bit more about how could you hack it. Like, there was a lot of going into various groups. Like, I hate to say it, but, like, I would go into, like, a product design group and I would share this amazing demo video that we got really well done by somebody overseas. And I'd be like, hey, like, looking, and we genuinely were still, but I was like looking for designers, like, here's the company. Anybody have any leads? And, like, we'd meet these great talented people that we might be able to hire one day, truly, but also we'd be able to reach these communities organically in that way, like travel nurses, flight attendants. We build out these networks on Kommu too, to
Interesting.
replicate what we saw in the market. So, for instance, there are home sharing groups for LGBTQ plus,
Yeah.
community members for women in travel. Our investors advisors wanted a safe network for women as well, for women to travel and share homes amongst each other. And all we had to do was essentially replicate those groups, give them the controls, ask them what they wanted built into it, and say, this is your group, you own it, and we're here to help. And that was another amazing growth hack for us, right? Just kind of saying, like, this is better than trying to social proof somebody on Facebook or on WhatsApp, and, like, try to find photos of the home from Google Drive. Here's this streamlined process with enough social proofing to get things going, and then we'll add more value as we scale these groups up.
Hmm. Correct. And you interestingly mentioned about brand and design. As a founder, you looking out for investments. You're doing BD, sales, finances, everything. But what are some of your biggest lessons when it came to crafting the message or messaging of on the marketplace to make it resonate with the target customers?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, and I guess I should have said this even on the last question. Like, another channel was just basically, I mean, there's influencer marketing, right? There's outsourced influencer marketing, which I
Yeah.
think is challenging because I think millennials and Gen Zers in particular know when they're being sold something, and it's kind of
Mhm.
like your brain turns away from that. So
Yeah.
that's not really an option, even if you have a huge budget. But then there was founder marketing, founder-led growth, and I
Yeah.
will say, when push came to shove, like, I do not love. I don't want to be like a famous founder. I hate the ego of this industry. If I'm being honest, when you grow up in LA, you know that celebrity is actually not a good thing.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean I don't want to be, like, successful and have, a lot of freedom. But that's all to say.
Yeah.
I also knew, though, that platforms like TikTok and Instagram, could give you massive distribution advantages, and it could humanize us as founders. That's to say, we knew that people loved what we were building and knew it wasn't perfect, but that by saying, hey, we're solving our own problem, we can't afford to travel. Here's all the people that are doing this with us and bringing them into the fold. We went viral a couple times on those channels, and they really drove our growth. And it was
Nice.
almost to say, even to investors too, hey, we know how to control the culture and how to actually play that game to make growth happen. But we do need to put these safeguards in place to control our growth so that we're ready for that scale, so that people don't actually have dangerous situations that they're walking into for home sharing. And
Hmm.
so, to your original question about brand and just how we built that in, it was an iterative process.
Yeah.
It was a lot about doing things that don't scale and talking to users constantly.
Right.
But ultimately, I think the edge of being LA founders in this home sharing battle is we know that brand matters, and we know
Yeah.
what good brand is, and we know what matters in the culture, and we've built towards that.
Hmm.
But now we need a better, I do think we need more people to support that function as we grow. But that's all to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just was instinctive to some extent, and also it was from user feedback.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Interesting. And what do you think is like the truly retained a sign of a truly retained user is in a marketplace? What are some of the metrics that you track? Uh,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for us, there was like really it was this theory that travel is becoming very social, right? And
yeah.
it's this idea that we traveled, like I said before, we travel to connect. And if you look at even Instagram behavior, it's there's this great piece. I think it's Eugene Way, status as a service. This idea that especially young people, like they're posting these trips that they're taking that they
Yeah.
are going into debt for because they're signaling to their network two things. One is, look, I'm valuable. I'm a world traveler. And the
Right.
second thing is also, I'm here. I'm around. Does anybody want to hang out? Because the awkward thing is, I've done this. Text your friends in New York. You're like, hey, I'm coming to New York. Does anybody have a place I can stay? And who wants to hang? And then you get kind of crickets, and you're like, that was embarrassing.
Yeah.
If you have any semblance of shame. Um, so um, so that's all to say that with this belief that social is driving travel, then you have a decision to make, right?
Mm.
You're like, how do we build social mechanisms into travel to make this thing work? And that's where we really came in and we said, let's also make this find my friends at the city level. Let's make people want to use this as a place to keep track of where their friends are based, where they're traveling, and then who they trust to share their homes with. And
Right.
the idea was that the KPI adjusted, right? If you look at like an Airbnb, they want you to come in twice a year
Yeah.
and they want you to book two trips, and that transaction value from those two trips that you're paying to a host is a massive business.
Yeah.
We are targeting generations of users that travel 30+% of the year now. They
Mm.
have massive housing costs, and we're saying we can turn them into very frequent engaged users. And so in our data right now, if you look at people that have sent or received a booking request, regardless of whether they accepted it or not, their engagement or retention is insane. It was 87% 10-month bounded retention when I last checked for anybody that received or sent a booking request. They come back to the app 18 times a month, and it
Well.
really it ties into this idea of like this aspirational traveler. Like instead of when you go to LA or something, if you're visiting, and then a friend's like, "Hey man, I was in New York. You could have stayed at my place or whatever," and it's always like after the fact. We're showing you that there's this whole network of places that you could be staying, this whole network of people that want to see you and that you want to see. And if you put that in one place, people will come back over and over and over
Mm.
again. It's like I go to Zillow all the time because I dream of buying a home one day. At this current
Yeah.
trajectory, it's not looking good, but it's because it's aspirational to me. It's what
Right. Right.
I dream of. And so we're doing the same thing, but we're making it actually attainable as well on a cost basis.
Got it. And I know you've been working on the product for some time, but what's been your like the biggest uh product mistake that you've done, or if you've done any?
Yeah, I think that me and my co-founder, we talk about this a lot because there's a conventional wisdom that we almost would say is part of like the Web 2 era,
Yeah.
that you should do things that don't scale, which
Yeah.
means like put up your crappy landing page and just like, say your value props and, learn from that. And it's kind of back to the same thing that we mentioned, the same concept of our brains have evolved when we like if I see a TikTok influencer and I know that they're hawking some product that they don't really care about, I know that like instinctively, I actually sometimes it actually pushes me away from the product and from that
Yeah.
that influencer and the trust there.
Right.
And so, but back to how that's relevant to doing things that don't scale. We built quite a few crappy, unscalable, versions of Kommu that were just like on Bubble or on, Typeform or whatever. And we did facilitate exchanges and we drove revenue actually there. And it turns out none of those could actually grow. None of them actually, made people want that feeling, have that aspirational feeling. If anything, it kind of reiterated that weird, like, I don't want to be on Craigslist doing this feeling.
Yeah.
And you learned a lot from that. But in retrospect, especially with the tools at our disposal now and with AI, like I would have gone back and I would have just gone for it and said, you know what, let's try to build this great, high fidelity, high brand, well designed experience. And let's focus on it from a design perspective
Right.
first, instead of from a functional perspective. And I think that's the new paradigm that we're in. And investors that don't think that that's the case in consumer are going to be proven wrong over and over again.
Mm. Got it. And in your view, what's the biggest reason, founders fail to get to, product market fit?
Yeah, I mean, there's survivorship bias obviously here, and I think product market fit is a very hard thing to define to some
Mm.
extent, especially in marketplaces. But ultimately, I do think that most founders, there's two things that happen. One is they quit because
Yeah.
it's incredibly hard, and I have, by the way, total respect for founders that quit. There have been plenty of people that have told me I should quit, and until I prove them wrong,
Yeah.
they might be right that the opportunity cost of my career is in their opinion, even though I think every day I'm learning more than I ever would in
Yeah.
any other career. um the second is they either pivot too often or they don't pivot enough, right? So ultimately it's to say, like, I think you see this sometimes at accelerators or in different places. They think, oh, I'm going to go do a lot of these customer discovery calls and I'm going to try this initial thing. And it's, again, maybe it's not high fidelity enough. Maybe there's one feature that they're missing, or a combination of features that they need to get to that they haven't tested for. And they're like, oh, there's no opportunity here, pivot.
Yeah.
And because that's just what the maybe the accelerator investors are forcing them to do, or they get stuck in their ways. And maybe some people I think maybe we have some of those qualities, but it's to say, like, you have this vision of what things should be, and you get myopic and you don't realize that there's broader opportunities, and you need to be malleable towards that to get to your milestones and to grow and what the value is there. So honestly, I think what's made us the founders we are and why we are on track, in my opinion, to hit product market fit
Mm.
is the resilience. It's like being, your back is up against the wall. You could have quit
Yeah.
1,000 times, but we have something to prove. We've always had a chip on our shoulder, and until we decide to walk away, we're going to keep knocking at that door, saying there's a huge opportunity here, and you'd be foolish not to give us a shot.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And especially when you work in travel industry, it's very competitive. But what advice do you give to founders on how to differentiate themselves in such a competitive market now?
Yeah, I mean, differentiation is such a huge part of it, and it's so stupid because it's not stupid, but it's like it's stupid in the sense that business school, again, like you talk about Porter's five forces and these things that are these general sort of tropes of business, but differentiation is a huge part of that, right? Like
Yeah.
you need to create a moat, and if you don't, like, that's why I think you're seeing a lot of B2B companies start to struggle, right? It's because it becomes a race to the bottom. Like, let's say you create a service that is clearly valuable and it doesn't have a huge differentiation to either in distribution or in value or function or whatever it is, and I see what's working and what's not as a user and both and a competitor. I can scale that up and price you, underprice you, or whatever it might be, and target a different market and maybe beat you. So differentiation in travel is really interesting only because a few things. One is, you're right, everybody believes that this market is already like been fully fleshed out, right? People think we're crazy to say that we're going to compete head to head with Airbnb. And we believe that in 10 years' time, they're going to be thinking like, that was crazy not to see how obvious a company like a Kommu
Yeah.
was. And in our case, right, it's a harder thing to sort of articulate to our users and to investors and to a lot of the shareholders that we need to say that to, because Airbnb is in our core market. It is something that is a brand that is so powerful and that they grew up with. Like, it's such a part of their experience currently. They're still booking oftentimes group travel on Airbnb. So how do you, without even telling them, without getting on a podcast and saying it to the masses, how do you say that in the product, say that in the marketing, and speak to it so that they
Yeah.
understand clearly how different we are from a short-term rental platform? And then I will say being social is, at least in the Kommu, world, is how I believe there's true differentiation. I do not believe that there are many companies that have a chance to really like blitz scale and drive that massive network effect that the Facebooks of the world and the Ubers, really did have. Some of that's being a first mover, whatever it might be. But I really believe that there's not a winner in a market until the social version of that market and that marketplace has been created and defined, and that ultimately creates the greatest feedback loops. It creates, that network effect that you get that organic growth that you really need, and it has massive staying power, right? Like, and I compass to LinkedIn all the time. Like, I'm on LinkedIn. I have opinions about the product, but that's to say, I'm not switching anytime soon because I've built out my network on LinkedIn. It's the one source of truth for my career. I'm sure that's what you pulled the information from before this podcast. And that's a tremendous moat. And we want to be the one source of truth for where your friends are based, where they're traveling, and who you trust to share your home with. And if we're doing that effectively across the world for our users, we can be with them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And even when, again, like I said, even when they're sharing their mansions with their 10 closest other rich friends, even though that's not the purpose and value of Kommu, it's not why we were, built, to be able to service that as a better alternative than, rich old people emailing each other, going out of their way to tell them that their mansion's available, looking for a house sitter or whatever it might be,
Right.
is a tremendous win for us. So that's our differentiation is focused on being that social player in this home sharing market.
Got it. Interesting. And obviously, I want to talk about AI because AI has changed. Is changing. What the SaaS world where I come from, and also with partnerships in BD. But where do you see AI? Do you think that AI is changing travel industry, and how is it going to change it going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I will say it's definitely going to be a monumental shift, but to me, it's
Mhm.
kind of it's akin to the internet boom, right? It's to say like this is that every company on earth that is a technology company is going to be an AI enabled company
Yeah.
or obviously an AI company, and that's no different in the travel sphere. I think there's a lot of opportunities with AI, and obviously, like we use those tools every day to say, much like a lot of startups, to say like we actually don't need 60 people
Yeah.
to run this company anymore, right? We need maybe 10,
Yeah.
maybe 5. And that's a huge win in and of itself of just not having to like continuously raise huge amounts of sums of money and have this ridiculous hurdle to hit that great companies shouldn't have to be held to or die if they don't hit it.
Yeah.
Um, but for us, I really think it comes back down to revealing the inventory of homes like available to you through that network. So like again, in the future, it'd be amazing to be like, oh, put some basic information in, connect to your Gmail, connect to your LinkedIn, whatever. And like, by the way, here's all the people that you should be connecting to through your alumni network,
Yeah.
through, friends of friends and so on and so forth. And then it's also about, I think, just the travel component of that too, right? Is to say like, in these open marketplaces and like the Yelps of the world, and there's a lot of this that is boomed out and it's caused this kind of distrust to some extent, right? Like Uber, Airbnb, Yelp. It's almost like these are open marketplaces, and they will have their own takes on AI and how it's going to benefit them. For us, I think it's to say you can get more bespoke to each user about their preferences, about their tendencies, about what they like and what they don't like, and you can be so much better at serving them the right solution to their problem. In our case, right, like your Kommu network, when you look at the app, it might be fundamentally different than mine. And it won't be because you built it, it took a ton of effort to build it out like I did with my LinkedIn effort. It's because you signed up with a few clicks and AI helped us
Yeah.
match you appropriately to the right people.
Mhm.
So that's really where I think that, and maybe, tracking your flights, if you allow us to let us like automatically list your place or trips to certain people, will be where AI makes a huge difference for a small team trying to, scale up and add value in that process.
Got it. Got it. Super interesting. And Bo, I quickly want to do the top three. What's your favorite business book?
0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. I know he's a controversial figure, but I remember reading that book before I ever worked at a startup and thinking like this guy, there's a lot of wisdom in that
Yeah.
book.
Yeah. No, absolutely. We'll put that in show notes. And if you can go back in time when you started working on Kommu, what is the one thing you would have focused on or done anything differently?
Yeah, I would have focused on just building before making business plans. In business school, we made so many business plans that are not even relevant, and it was a helpful exercise. But like in the tech world, it's about putting products out into the market, seeing how people use and engage with them, and then being quick and nimble towards finding product market fit. A business plan is really relevant when you have cash flow.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And what's your favorite online tool, for example, Gmail, Slack, Zoom?
I mean, I gotta say, I love Superhuman. I'm definitely, I think my email inbox is already out of control, but Superhuman has made that amazing for me to manage, and I love what that team's done there. But yeah, that and Airtable has been pretty amazing as of late. I've been utilizing Airtable in a lot of different ways, and I never would have thought that some Excel on the cloud would be that beneficial, and I'm blown away. Oh, and but of course, Zapier by far and away is like one of my favorite companies, and I think what they've done is amazing.
Got it. No, absolutely. We'll put that in the show notes. And but what's the best way people can reach out to you and know more about Kommu?
Yeah, I mean, all of our socials are at Go Kommu, GOKOMMU. We're really on Instagram, TikTok, and the website is gokommu.com. You can follow our founder journey. It's at Bo and Gus on TikTok. So we talk a lot about what we're building and where we're at. But you can just download Kommu. I'm publicly listed in LA, so you can DM me and message me. We have a feedback group too if you have any feedback on the app, and we're all building this together. So we appreciate any and all conversations to get to this product that we think is going to be big.
Got it. No, absolutely. We'll put that in show notes. Yeah, well, thank you so much for taking our time and speaking to us. I really enjoyed my conversation with you.
Thank you so much for the great questions and the opportunity to talk to such an amazing audience, and I really appreciate you having me on the show, Ray.